Good afternoon, everyone.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. How are you doing, Rifites? We're having such a beautiful weather here in Semarang.
Yeah, I'm doing good. I think the weather is quite perfect to support our activities today, Amigdad.
It is,
Thank you
it
for
is.
asking anyway. How about you?
I'm doing really great since we're going to have such a great session with Dr. William Locke and of course our moderator as well, Mr. Faik. So what are we going to do, Rifa, actually today in the session?
We're going to have a session with Dr. William Locke and talking about the linkage of environmental politics and global development. Anyway, I'm curious about the condition of our audience. Should we call one of them?
Yeah, sure. Who you got your attention to, Rifa?
Let me take a look first. How about
Mr. Muhammad Sakti?
Okay. Where is it? I cannot see him yet.
Hi, hello.
Hi.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Good morning, Professor.
How's your condition today, Mr.
I
Muhammad?
was one of your students at University of Sussex. I was the one who invited you to this beautiful session. Before, if you remember, I emailed you maybe last month.
Wow, what a coincidence, Rifa.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. Lovely to hear your voice again.
Yeah, I was one of your students at Social Change, Culture and Development, autumn last year.
Oh, great. Well, good to hear you again.
Good to hear.
Right. It's amazing, isn't it, Rifa? We're having Dr. William Locke's former student here with us. So I'm really hoping that we can actually have a really good discussion session later on. Okay, maybe we can just start right away, Rifa.
Okay, first of all, we would like to
Okay,
introduce ourselves
first of all, we would like to introduce ourselves first.
I'm Rifa Imtinan.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm Rifa Imtinan.
And I'm Mikdad Ismail.
And we are from the Department of International
And we are from the Relations
University
University
Diponegoro,
Negoro,
Indonesia.
Indonesia.
Okay. And today we're going to be the host for the session, the linkage of environmental politics and global development, with the esteemed speaker, Dr. William Locke from the University of Sussex. So we're going to have 4 agenda for today: their introduction, material presentation, ice-breaking session, Q&A, and closing session. This session is going to be moderated by Mr. Muhammad Faik Adi Protomo, SIP MSc from the International Relations Department, Universitas Diponegoro.
Mr. Faik Adi
MSc is the lecturer at International Relations Department, Universitas Diponegoro. He is a researcher with focus on terrorism, de-radicalization, radicalization, women's rights, and nuclear safeguard. He obtained his bachelor's degree majoring in international relations from Universitas Gadjah Mada, Indonesia, and he obtained his master's degree majoring in strategic studies and focusing in terrorism studies from S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Singapore. Mr. Faik is strongly interested in research-based activism and being part of an organization which advocates policies through research. Therefore, his experiences involve around research. He began his research experience in 2017 by producing a joint research paper on nuclear non-proliferation in the Korean Peninsula for the NEREC Young Fellow at KAIST University, Korea. In 2019, he joined Center for Indonesian Policy Studies, or CIPS, conducted research policy paper. In 2019, he joined Kantor Staf Presiden, or KSP, conducted research on government policy. He also continued his journey for a couple years as research analyst at Bappenas and DPRD DKI Jakarta.
His proficiency also involves around religious violence, collective political violence, gender violence, and security in Southeast Asia, and hegemonic masculinity and aggrieved entitlement. Throughout his journey, he has achieved several awards. In 2016, he became the paper presenter at International Conference on Feminism. In 2018 to 2019, he involves in dissertation track at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Singapore, with dissertation titled The Front Pembela Islam, National Identity, Hate Speech and Demonization. In 2019, His poster in understanding of nuclear weapon-related issues among practitioners in Indonesia has been accepted in CTBT Science and Technology Conference 2019 Austria, and many more achievements to come. Okay, Riva. So maybe we can actually have our moderator here with us.
Yes.
Yes.
Hello,
Hello, Mr.
Hello, Mr.
Faiq. How are you
Faiq.
today?
I'm fine, thank you. Thank you for introducing me.
Okay, so really great that we have Mr. Faiq here with us as our moderator, Riva. Okay.
Yeah.
We cannot wait
We cannot wait to
Um,
hear about the session today. So, Mr. Faiq, the floor is yours.
Okay, good morning, Dr. William. Today we're going to have, as the MCs have outlined, we're going to have a session on the linkage between development and global development and international politics. Before we begin, please allow me to introduce Dr. William. He has kindly provided us his CV. I shall read his CV first in order to introduce him to our audience. So as we can see, Dr. William has investigated the changing role of forests and carbon in the global economy. And this has come with a particular focus on how this is reflected in the production of space and nature at a local level. And Dr. Williams' ethnographic work has been focused primarily in the Peruvian High Amazon in the region of San Martin, working with cacao farmers. Dr. William took a political ecology approach to analyze the value chains, landscapes, and ideologies produced by for-profit voluntary market conservation and reforestation projects. Dr. William is now taking this work further in order to examine what it means to produce nature as a solution to climate change, particularly with reference to net zero targets, and how it changes forest governments and development outcomes when this is done by for-profit groups. And as we can see, Dr. William has completed his PhD in development studies with the thesis title of Trees, Forests, and Farmers, For-Profit Conservation and Voluntary Carbon Markets in Peru. And he has done his MSc in Social Research Methods in the University of Sussex and graduated with distinction. He has had his MA in Environment, Development, and Policy, also in the University of Sussex in 2011-2012. And his BA was in Cinema, Photography, and Television Studies in the University of Leeds. He is currently a lecturer and in the University of Sussex. Before he has experience being a doctoral tutor and also a guest lecturer and also a research associate on the ESRC-funded Sussex Sustainability Research Program, which is an interdisciplinary project focusing on investigating possible trade-offs among the SDGs. He was also employed as a senior account manager, and he has been a member in several professional memberships, which is the Higher Education Academy and also the Associate Fellow Status of the Higher Education Academy. Dr. William has been the recipient of a number of awards, fellowship, and grants from the University of Sussex and also the ESRC DTC PhD. And Dr. William Locke has also published a number of papers and has presented a variety of his works in various workshops and presentations, including in the Political Ecology Network, Pollen, on building green infrastructure, courting and concealing crisis, narratives of failure and success in carbon forestry in San Martin, Peru. And in 2020 Climate Justice Perspectives on Negative Emissions. He was invited to attend a workshop and share research with civil society organizations regarding negative emission technologies. And also he was invited to the biennial conference of the Political Ecology Network, or POLIN, on building green infrastructure, how carbon conservation and reforestation are redefining the forest in San Martin, Peru. He has also had a number of media engagements, and he possesses a variety of experience and qualifications and skills. And so maybe without further ado, we can introduce Dr. William with his presentation. Good morning, Dr. William.
Good morning. I'm not sure I've ever had my CV read to me before. It makes you realize where you've got mistakes in it. Thank you for that.
Live and learn. Yes. So Dr. William has a presentation. We will show your presentation So Dr. William has also already given us his presentation on global development and the environmental agenda.
Are you able to give me screen sharing privilege, and then I can flick the slides?
Okay.
Just there's quite a few of them. If you just make me a co-host or something, and then I can.
Sure.
Let me see. Here we go. This should work. If you just bear with me one sec. Can you see that now?
Thank you. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So should I get started? Are we ready to go, or?
So we will now begin the lecture, and please, for all the students, pay attention. Thank you. We yield the floor to Dr. William.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you, obviously, for the introduction, but also for the invitation to speak. So thanks to the organisers as well. I think this is a really fascinating summer course. It was great to look through the kind of agenda that's being planned for this week and next week. It looks really interesting. So I hope you've enjoyed the talks thus far, and it looks like you've got some really interesting ones to come as well. Just to kind of expand on that long introduction of my kind of career today, in a kind of summarised way, my name's Dr. Will Locke. I'm a lecturer in international development and anthropology at the University of Sussex, which is a university near the city of Brighton on the south coast of the UK, so just in the south of the UK. And my research kind of fits broadly into what's known as political ecology, but kind of focuses mainly on carbon markets, particularly the justice implications of carbon offsetting, as well as looking at conservation and reforestation schemes, particularly in Peru, as well as agricultural models. So I'm interested in the kind of trade-off between plantation or industrial agriculture and agroecology, and how that comes together with kind of global goals and global development goals and local ecologies. So those are some of the themes that we're going to be touching on today in this talk, and exploring this connection between global development and environmental politics. And to think about that link or that kind of connection, we're going to start by zooming out really and considering this overarching question at the bottom of this slide here, which is not just how do institutions shape environmental governance, but how do global narratives shape local environmental politics? And we're going to start by going over some ground that potentially some of you are more familiar with, others perhaps not, exploring the kind of idea of development and how this has been shaped by specific ideologies, specific actors, how we can view development as a discourse in this sense. We'll then move on to how that translates to sustainable development today. Firstly, giving a kind of brief history of its emergence in global politics, before seeing how this has been translated into policy through a kind of narrowing of these ideas around the logic of green growth. I'll then use the example of net zero promises and carbon markets, so that's drawing on some of my own research, to show how this narrows potential solutions to climate change and the kind of implications that this can have for communities, for livelihoods, and for ecologies as well. And then we'll wrap up today by thinking about how this relates to the things that you're discussing on this summer course, okay? So the role of local wisdom, questions of justice, and alternatives to dominant or hegemonic modes of development thinking, and how these can be embraced. And then before we move on, I guess, to the interactive parts of the class and the Q&A, which I'm really looking forward to. Okay, but before we get going and before we actually start with the talk properly, I just want you to take a few seconds to kind of step back and reflect on this question here. What does sustainable development mean to you? And I don't mean here the kind of academic or dictionary definition. I'm interested kind of what it means to you personally, or what it might look like in the context that you're familiar with, whether that's kind of country, a city, a region, or whatever. You know, what does it feel like, and what role do we all play in sustainable development? So I'm just going to pause speaking just for kind of 15 seconds here to give you a chance to have a think about that. You don't need to write anything down. You know, it can just be in your head, or you can write things down if you fancy it, and we'll maybe return to them at the end. So I'm just going to give you 15 seconds to think about that question. Now, if we're in a classroom right now, which is always the best way to teach face-to-face, we'd have a chance to discuss these. But those silences on Zoom are always so strange. So I'll leave that there, but hopefully you've got a few ideas there of what sustainable development might mean to you. And after we get towards the end of this kind of lecture section or talk, we're going to go back to think about those ideas and how they differ to what we're discussing now. Okay, so let's kick off with the talk. And we start here on this idea of development as discourse, okay? And development in itself is a slightly complex and convoluted concept. It can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. What I want to start by discussing is the way that it's framed by certain groups and the power that has to produce certain policies and programs. And when we think about development in that kind of broad way, we can think about it in a range of ways, really. So we can think about it as an idea, a kind of vague concept that we have of what development might mean, of a kind of sense of things improving or things kind of progressing in a certain way. We might think about development as a set of practices, about the kind of projects, proposals that are put together in the name of development, the way development is done in practice. We might think about development as an industry, thinking about the types of actors involved. You know, you've got not just governments and government bodies, regional governments, but also those kind of supranational groups that set what development is, as well as various NGOs, from very big to very small, civil society, and even the private sector involved as well. So we can think about it as an industry as any other in the global economy. More broadly, we can think about development as a geography or creating geographies. You know, these terms I have on the slide here, third world, global south. These are concepts created by the idea of development. So in a way, it's a sense of geography as well. Or even broader than that, we can think about it as a desire. It's an idea that people want to develop, want to have development, whether that's for them, their family, their community, or their country. There's a sense there is a desire for certain groups to a kind of development. So we can break it down in a number of ways, and so much is kind of tied up with this vague idea of what development might be. But I think the task for anyone studying development is this one at the bottom, trying to kind of prise apart the discourses of development from the empirical reality of what actually happens. And when we think about discourses of development and how it's been framed over the years, what's often taken as the kind of founding moment of the modern idea of development is this speech from President Harry S. Truman in his inaugural address as President of the United States, in which he said, "What we envisage is a program of development based on the concept of democratic fair dealing, greater production is the key to prosperity and peace. And the key to greater production is a wider and more vigorous application of modern scientific and technical knowledge. So you can already see here in his idea of what development is, there's a certain framing of what might be included within that. And this idea and this way of framing development stems in a large part from the experience of post-World War II Europe and the kind of rebuilding of the continent after the war, a sense that economic growth will benefit all globally. So recovering economies in Europe would actually help the global economy in general. And with it, a real focus on kind of grand, centralized, state-led projects of growth, focused in particular on infrastructure and social systems. And it's very much that experience then, that kind of approach that framed how development could and should be done in other countries in the early kind of 60s and 70s. This idea of statism, national planning, investing in the nation states themselves and prescribing these kind of large scale solutions to governments. So as I mentioned, that particularly came in the form of infrastructure. This is the very famous Aswan Dam in Egypt on the left here. Also those large scale social projects. So an emphasis on education, on vaccination programs, healthcare, those kind of things. But the idea here was that this planning and delivery should be centralized. It's a vision of development in which foreign governments support local governments, but in doing so, imposing kind of particular ideas and ideals of how development should be done and what it should lead to. Then as this kind of large scale top-down development was deemed to be kind of faltering or not working, poverty started to become the new focus for development. We often think of that as a kind of timeless focus of development, but it was really in the 70s that it started to be the focused development programs. In a famous speech in 1973, the World Bank president, Robert McNamara, coined the actual term absolute poverty. And he was the first to communicate the World Bank's twin goals to accelerate economic growth and reduce poverty. And those two twin goals are quite important to remember here. But the world of development continued to reflect the wider kind of economic changes. So particularly through the neoliberal era, through the kind of 80s and 90s, poverty started to become framed as a matter of income and consumption. There's a focus on quantifiable indicators and national level aggregate measurements, particularly GDP. Poverty was considered at this point a kind of lack of integration into global markets. And that kind of experience of poverty was leveled out. It was deemed kind of homogenous, caused by overall low conditions. So an emphasis here in the development world on GDP and basic economic indicators, as well as a faith, or at least a growing faith, in the private sector, that this wealth would, in the kind of neoliberal language, trickle down eventually to everyone. The point of this kind of very potted history is that these have all come to be seen in some way or another as kind of received wisdom in development circles. But the history of how they've become central and the kind of political implications of centering them have been obscured. And this has been explored by numerous scholars, but perhaps most famously by Arturo Escobar, a Colombian anthropologist. And I believe you've all had a chapter from his Encountering Development shared with you. But in this book, Escobar highlights how the discourses of development circulate and both structure and reflect not only development policy, but the very way that people see the world. As he states of globalization, scratch a globalization discourse and you'll find Homo economicus at large, alleged individuals striving to become miniature capitalist clones, assumptions of linear rationality as the default mode of thinking, of those wanting to make it in a competitive world, a view of nature as a resource to be extracted at any cost, or even groups and movements struggling from the inside to recapture the modern project for emancipatory purposes. So here he's framing development as a kind of ideological process in itself, what he deems the last and failed attempt to complete the Enlightenment in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So here we have development as containing all of these kind of ideological assumptions. Behind that seemingly apolitical or technocratic scheme, a kind of ideological understanding of the world. And I think we can understand development in these terms, it's kind of tied up with these vague and overlapping ideas or ideals of progress, of modernity, and of economic growth. And I think these are important to understand before we move on to thinking about what sustainable development is today. And thinking about development as progress, I think this is the kind of classic story of development. You know, that there was a kind of singular journey that most societies move on, from kind of backward people scrabbling around in the dirt. At some point, there's a kind of industrialization as society progresses, and then magically this leads to a kind of current mass consumption era in which people have lots of goods, you know. And this is a kind of trajectory of progress that's viewed, and what Sherman refers to in development as an unconditional belief in this concept of progress. But the idea here is that there's a single trajectory that everyone follows, with an assumed endpoint of these kind of wealthy, well-off people in consumerist societies. And rather than this just being a vague idea of progress, it was actually codified in various ways, perhaps most famously through the idea of modernity and modernization theory. And this is Rostov's modernization theory, visualized as his 5 stages of economic development. Notably, and kind of critically for our understanding of this as an ideological project, this was subtitled A Non-Communist Manifesto. But Rostov really turned that idea of a kind of singular story of progress into a model that he thought countries could follow, and all countries would eventually follow, where they went from an initial stage of a kind of traditional society based on subsistence, barter, agriculture, moving through to a kind of transitional stage of specialization, a building up of surpluses and a development of infrastructure, before that kind of takeoff industrialization stage, and then a drive to maturity with diversification, less reliance on imports, before finally reaching this kind of final stage of high mass consumption. And obviously there's an awful lot to point out that's incorrect with this model, but I think what's interesting is what Rostov was really emphasizing was this idea that we could measure where different societies were on this kind of single ladder of progress. And what I want to emphasize here is that not only that this reflects a specific understanding and misreading, I would say, of the history of development, but it also prescribes a way of doing development, framed for encouraging things to happen, as I have down on this slide, an incredibly influential one. You know, it kind of prioritized technical approaches. Modern technology is viewed as the thing that's going to lead to change. That alongside that, there needs to be a change in ways of thinking, that you need to educate, there needs to be extension services, but there is a correct way of thinking about the world that should be imposed to reach that higher point. And a kind of administrative focus, and a focus on getting the bureaucracy and state right. So an idea of there's a way that they should function, what's commonly referred to now as kind of the good governance agenda. And so hopefully you can see here some of the assumptions that Escobar critiques, but also perhaps reflect on how these can still be seen in current approaches. And I think this final point on the slide here is an important one. This framing suggests that the traditional is actually a barrier to the modern, to progress and to development. So it's underpinned by a kind of particular ideology of modernity. And that's that even as it's saying that everyone is on this kind of continuum and that everything, you know, all societies will eventually progress through these different stages, it also fundamentally sets up a dichotomy between those who are developed and those who are not. You know, a kind of separation between the traditional and the modern. And here the kind of undeveloped is framed as primitive, the old ways of being. So, you know, the modern gets associated with industry, with industrialization, urban living, secularism, you know, a kind of rejection of mythologies, beliefs, religions that came with the Enlightenment period. And then on the other side, there's an idea that it's agricultural societies, rural living, religious beliefs, or a connection to nature. And while these ideas have kind of been assumed or implicit in how many Europeans view most of the world, it was interesting actually in the kind of post-colonial era, particularly with the breakdown of the British Empire and the French Empire, that many newly independent countries after that, you know, continue to embrace similar ideas of modernity, this kind of pushed progress, an ideology of modernity itself. And I've added a reference for a fascinating reading on this by Leander Schneider about the Maasai. And the Maasai famously wear this red ochre on their face, as in this picture here. And she quotes Julius Nyerere, who was the first president of Tanzania and a very famous left-wing thinker and politician. And he calls on the Maasai. He says, you must reject in total to be equated with wild animals, and you must discard the habit of wearing red ochre. We preserve wild animals for the tourist industry, but that cannot be with human beings. You must progress and develop as your fellow compatriots and the rest of the country. So you need to become modern. So you can see how this kind of damaging setting up of a dichotomy here. And we can see also how those kind of seemingly benign stories of progress and modernity obscure this kind of violence done to people's lives. And certainly since the kind of 70s and 80s, these ideas have been cloaked specifically in seemingly neutral metrics and statistics of progress, most commonly kind of poverty indicators and GDP and these kind of measures of aggregate economic growth. And we can explore this in more detail, but I just want to kind of point out the longer term trajectory of economic growth and some of its issues. And this is from a recent UN report on extreme poverty, which I think sums this up neatly. And Philip Alston, the special rapporteur, says that the global economy has doubled since the end of the Cold War, yet half the world lives under $5.50 a day, primarily because the benefits of growth have largely gone to the wealthiest. Between 1980 and 2016, the top 1% captured 27% of total real income growth, and in 2017, captured 82% of new wealth. Meanwhile, incomes of the poorest have grown far slower than global GDP. The bottom 50% now have less than 1% of total global wealth, while the top 1% hold 45%. So you see this sharpening inequality and divide that this aggregate economic growth is not delivering and promised that it had. But focusing more directly on what this means for development, Alston goes on to say that using historic growth rates and excluding any negative effects of climate change, an impossible scenario, so suggesting nothing bad happens from climate change, it would still take 100 years to eradicate poverty under the World Bank's poverty line, which is far too low, and 200 years under a $5 a day line. This would also require a 15 or 173-fold increase in global GDP, respectively. So we've set up a really challenging situation here. It's a damning assessment from a body that's committed to economic growth on a number of levels, but we're still charging forward with a model of growth that doesn't seem to be working, and we're assuming all the time that it will still deliver. And I think it's fair to say that the kind of contradictions of economic growth have become more and more apparent. Rather than that simple ladder that everyone is on to progress, we see that poverty and development might well be two sides of the same coin. Okay, so you can see how they exist side by side, and also we're becoming ever more aware of how they feed each other, how the cheap labour and poverty supports the development of the wealthy. And most obviously with this, we can think about colonialism here, which was often framed in many ways as a story of development itself, the story of industrialization, the spread of science and technology. But really, looking back on it, we can see it and review that as the greatest extraction of wealth in history, forcing us to reconsider if development was in fact fueled by exploitation rather than that story of progress. And this stat here never fails to kind of shock me. Britain took nearly $45 trillion from India during the colonial period. So we have these emerging contradictions with the story of development as progress, as modernity, as economic growth. And this was becoming apparent on a number of levels in the 1970s and 80s as well. And in some ways, that's the kind of history of sustainable development that I want to start from here. How it was meant to be a kind of break on this growth, a reason to stop and consider the damage that might be being done in the name of progress. And the basic idea of sustainable development comes from the insight that economic, agricultural, industrial, or population growth cannot continue forever. And while I disagree with quite a lot of those framings and the way that's been done historically, these ideas have been discussed and studied for a very, very long time. But I don't want to start from its real beginnings there, the kind of practical concerns that emerged in the industrial era with the threats of pollution, or even the kind of Malthusian arguments to the limits to population growth, but how it started to really enter the development lexicon and to connect these worlds of global development and the environmental agenda. And I'm just going to give a very potted history of this. And And what I would say the real kind of lightning rod moment, the real key starting point here was the release of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962, this book on the right. And Carson was a marine biologist working for the US Bureau of Fisheries, and then became a writer and conservationist. But Silent Spring was about the threat of pesticides on local populations, such as birds, but also on the wider biosphere. You know, it was this idea that birds were dying off at such a rate where eventually you get to the point where there'll be a silent spring, no more bird song in spring. And her biographer has noted that she quite self-consciously in this book decided to write a book calling into question the paradigm of scientific progress that defined post-war American culture. And I've got 3 dates on here of where this kind of questioning of the development paradigm, this questioning of progress in this sense really started to take center stage. First, the UN's 1972 Human Environment Conference in Stockholm, Sweden, where the debate between the two worlds really reached the UN for the first time. Then the establishment of the World Commission on Environment and Development, the WCED, in 1983 by the UN Secretary General, which really put sustainability on the development agenda. And then finally, the release of the landmark Brundtland Report in 1987. But here, the kind of ideas of Silent Spring and the wider critiques of untrammeled development began to be integrated into the development debate. You know, before that, there was this almost unquestioned modernism behind development, those big projects focus on growth. And in some ways, this could be said to mark the end of modernization theory as official orthodoxy in development, although as we'll go on to discuss, the kind of assumptions and discourses are still very much alive. And the Brundtland Report expressed concerns at the unintended effects of industrial-led development on the planet and its ecosystem. So it was quite important for this. I disagree with an awful lot of what is in this report, but I think it's important to think about how it was framed in this early stage. There was a real focus within the Brundtland Report on world population as it's projected to double in the 21st century. It was even more rapid than that in many ways. But it really drew on this idea of a vicious cycle in the relation between environment and poverty. So growing populations put pressure on resources, that causes overexploitation of resources and environmental degradation. And then that in turn continues to deplete the resources which people depend on. I think that story is far too simplistic. I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that there is such a vicious cycle. And I feel that places the blame too heavily on those who don't really cause the damage. But the Brundtland Report did also point out that this was connected also to the kind of excessive consumption of wealthy groups as well. So there was a sense that there was this result of a cocktail of wealth and poverty as it framed it. But the main thing I want to point out from the Brundtland Report is that the kind of optimism that surrounded development, the development industry before this point, had started to be replaced by a kind of fear of the unintended consequences, the kind of unintended effects on the environment, but also the social and political repercussions. But it leaves us here with the Brundtland's famous definition of sustainable development, which is still used and is still the kind of generally accepted definition today. It's development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. But this change in debates, that kind of change in language and the way it started to be discussed in those higher levels of policy, took time to be reflected in the development orthodoxy and how it was integrated into measures and policy. And in this kind of historical narrative, the next important moment was the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, officially the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. And this built on the kind of perspectives of the Brundtland Report to try to introduce ideas of sustainability into development planning and action. Okay, so it had 27 key principles, and it was the first of many non-binding voluntary action plans, which we've seen so many of since. Zooming forward, the next major milestone was Rio +20s. This is 20 years later after that famous 1992 conference. And at Rio +20, there were much more focused attempts to introduce sustainability into how we might measure development. Okay, so to connect sustainability to the Millennium Development Goals as they were. So this idea could be seen kind of previously, but this is when it started to take center stage, to really take over. So there's an explicit link to the Millennium Development Goals, but also it began to frame the very idea of what was to come next, which was obviously the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the SDGs, which were released in 2015 with this report, Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. But you can see that not just environmental goals have started to be adopted in the SDGs, but also, interestingly, some of those ideas that we've explored so far, ideas around technology and energy and things and consumption. And I think the SDGs contain many, many laudable goals. And while I'm going to go on to question some of the assumptions behind some of these, it's really notable looking at them now, close as we are to 2030, to see how ambitious they are. And I feel like we're probably further away from most of them than we were when we started. I don't think we're very close to ending poverty or ending hunger, which is, unacceptable. But it's interesting to look at that level of ambition that there was back in 2015 for these. But I want to come back to the kind of main thrust of this talk. What are these global discourses of sustainable development, and what does this mean for local environmental politics? And Jeffrey Sachs is perhaps the most famous advocate for this kind of model of sustainable development. And here, this is a quote from his famous book, The Age of Sustainable Development, where he says, sustainable development calls for a world in which economic progress is widespread, extreme poverty is eliminated, social trust is encouraged through policies that strengthen the community, and the environment is protected from human-induced degradation. And here we can kind of begin to interrogate a return to a kind of simplified narrative of progress in sustainable development. And I'm sure we can all agree in a world where poverty is eliminated, that's a good thing, and where the environment is protected. But beyond those kind of vague claims, it's interesting to look at the words that are used, and what are the implications of suggesting that there needs to be widespread economic progress? What does he mean by extreme poverty in this context? And how on earth do you encourage social trust through policies that strengthen communities? Who are we to go in and dictate what these communities might need? So I think there's some interesting assumptions that are starting to be brought into the orthodoxy of what sustainable development is. And what I really want to point out today is that we have a concept here in this idea of sustainable development that's being framed with certain assumptions about both of these terms. Firstly, development as kind of narrowed down to just economic growth, and again, aggregate economic growth. And then sustainability in this kind of very narrow sense around specific measurements and metrics, but a kind of sense of global protection rather than an idea of integration with. And beyond those two assumptions, there's a kind of third one that joins them together, that both development as economic growth and sustainability as that kind of global protection can not just coexist, not just that it's possible, but that they depend on each other. And that's what I want to move on to next, this idea of green growth, how this is manifested in a very, very narrow idea of sustainable development, wrapped up in those old ideas of growth, of progress and modernity. So just to kind of recap on that framing that Sachs has put together there, and again, this is from his book, he says that the conventional view is that there are important trades-off in pursuing economic, social and environmental goals. If a society aims for more equality, it will end up less rich. A poor society must choose between growth and the environment. That view is much too pessimistic. Sustainable development offers synergies rather than trade-offs in the pursuit of efficiency, equity and sustainability. So there are assumptions and assumptions being made here by Sachs. Firstly, the environmental goals cannot take precedence over other aspects of development. We have to prioritize development first and environmental goals will follow. And secondly, within this, the idea that those environmental goals are probably not achievable without broader economic and social progress. There still needs to be a model of growth and progress followed to achieve those goals. I think those are very serious assumptions that are hidden in what is being said. But just to define that term green growth a little bit further and to point out how this has become kind of so central to the way that we think of sustainable development today, this is green growth as summarized by the OECD as fostering economic growth and development while ensuring that the natural assets continue to provide the resources and environmental services on which our well-being relies. and then by two key critics of green growth. The promise is that technological change and substitution will improve the ecological efficiency of the economy, and that governments can speed this process with the right regulations and incentives. So just to unpack that a little bit more and think about the idea of green growth, firstly, that kind of framing of sustainable development, it concedes that economic growth has historically caused environmental damage, that there has been an issue that has linked that environmental growth, particularly on the aggregate level, with environmental destruction and carbon emissions. So it accepts that problem with the model we have. However, it suggests within that we can decouple economic growth from carbon emissions and environmental damage. And this is an important concept, an important piece of language that's used for this idea of green growth, the idea of decoupling, that economic growth can continue, but that we can remove that connection to carbon emissions and environmental damage. And this concept of decoupling is central to the development policies at the moment, but also most of our climate modelling. So these integrated assessment models that plan what's going to happen or suggest the different ways things could happen with climate change all factor in certain degrees of decoupling. And as I put here, it's also really important to this shift in discourse of what sustainable development is and how it can be pursued. And I wanted to give you an example of this from the UK, or from the ex-Prime Minister of the UK, thankfully, Boris Johnson. And this was a speech he gave to the UN General Assembly in the run-up to the Conference of Party, the COP meeting in Glasgow last year. And he said, if we are to stave off these hikes in temperature, we must go further and faster. We need all countries to step up and commit to very substantial reductions by 2030. And I passionately believe that we can do it by making commitments in 4 areas: coal, cars, cash, and trees. I'm not one of those environmentalists who take a moral pleasure in excoriating humanity for its success. I don't see the green movement as a pretext for a wholesale assault on capitalism. Far from it. The whole experience of the COVID pandemic is that the way to fix the problem is through science and innovation. The breakthroughs and the investment are made possible by capitalism and by free markets. And it's through our Promethean faith in new green technology that we are cutting emissions in the UK. You know, for a start, there's a number of factual inaccuracies within this, particularly the way that he talks up the UK's attempts to bring down emissions, which are false. But just more generally here, there's a suggestion that reductions are possible through this very, very narrow set of areas, you know, and that it's possible through a faith in technology and markets, a Promethean faith, a world-building faith. I think this is very interesting language for us to pick apart and dissect. But it also takes us back to this idea of the unconditional belief in a concept of progress that will eventually all go through this road or ladder to progress, but that we've just kind of replaced that final point of being mass consumption. It's now being kind of enlightened green consumption or enlightened sustainable worlds. Okay, so we've still got this faith in technological, often top-down solutions. And within this, the idea that capitalists and free markets will, if we just let them get on with their work, provide wealth for all, and this will eventually deliver, kind of ignoring some of the contradictions within this. You know, it's reflected by a number of policy approaches, particularly this faith in technology, that mention of cars in Boris Johnson's speech. There's such a focus on delivering electric cars to just replace the cars that we have without thinking about the environmental damage that they themselves do. You know, the unbelievable amount of materials and minerals needed to create these cars, not least lithium, which needs to be extracted for the batteries. And the way this is kind of coalesced around ideas of eco-modernism, that we can have similar social systems, similar levels of consumption that we have today, simply replacing the systems we have with ones that are greener. And within all this, an idea that innovation is going to substantially change how we do things. And you get these kind of odd pictures, like this one in the bottom right, which suggests a kind of future of technological farming. I've spent a lot of my life on farms and I've never seen one like this. But I always think when I see these pictures, you know, how much it's hiding. Like, to set up a farm like that would involve a huge amount of money and centralization of resources. But all of that is hidden behind a kind of Panglossian or very hopeful view of the future as being able to deliver for all. But beyond these ideas, I think we can think about how that discourse has fundamentally changed the actors who have a role to play in this, who has a seat at the table and whose voice counts in a world pursuing green growth. So we can think about the kind of obvious groups of governments and negotiating blocs and how they might have changed somewhat in recent years. But also those supranational organizations playing an ever larger role and being able to dictate those policies on a global level, the UN, the United Nations Environment Programme, the World Trade Organization, which has a massive influence. But also the role it has on NGOs, on local charities and organizations that are scaling up to such a rapid scale. You get these giant global NGOs now that have a huge amount of power, what are known as the big international NGOs, brilliantly called bingos. But also the way that this discourse invites, I guess, the kind of companies and corporations to join in with this vision of what sustainable development should be, because they're the ones being asked to deliver it. So you're getting companies and corporations able to set the agenda in many ways, and particularly the kind of major transnational corporations and the business leaders who are hailed as potential leaders in the sustainability field as well. So you have people like Elon Musk or Bill Gates, some of the largest consumers in the planet, being hailed as the solution to climate change or holding the solution to climate change. These are important changes in global political economy, I think. There's also been a kind of professionalization and regulation of what we know as sustainable development. So there's a real importance of things like indices, of international codes, standards, frameworks, and with it, this kind of raft of new consultants, lawyers, and auditors. So we see an ever greater role of groups like PwC, KPMG, Linklaters, all of these big, lawyer firms and auditing firms are able to have a say in what development is and imposing certain ideals on how it should be done. And we can see this as a kind of reflection of what's promoted and valued, but also the way that these groups come together in certain spaces. And I think these spaces are important to pay attention to. So whether they're conventions, the giant conferences, or more on a smaller scale, the kind of workshops or award ceremonies where these groups come together. So obviously the conference of party meetings are huge, but also Davos, where the kind of rich circulate their ideas of what sustainability is. So here we might argue, and I would certainly argue, that there's a growing consensus around these ideas of sustainable development, around a kind of common future built around these ideas of green growth and eco-modernism. And all of these meetings, and these are the Conference of Parties meetings that we've had, and the last one, as I say, was in the UK, in Glasgow. And I think it's interesting to reflect also on the growing role of, or the changing role of different actors within this, and particularly the growing role of the private sector. I think most shockingly at Katowice in Poland a few years back, the coal industry was probably the main group involved. You think, wow, why the coal industry having such a large impact on why we're having these debates? What I want to kind of point out from this approach is that growing consensus, but also an increasing confidence that there is a solution, that we're bit by bit getting closer to the policies that will lead us there. And that's the bit that worries me, because I don't think that's backed up by reality. And this is a stat that never fails to blow me away. Since the first IPCC report was published in 1990, just before the Rio Summit of 92 that I opened this kind of section with, more anthropogenic fossil CO2 has been released into the atmosphere than previously throughout all of human history. So since we've known about it and centered this problem so much in development, we've emitted more carbon than through all of human history before that. That's stunning in a lot of ways. We're accelerating even though we know the consequences. And I think that's problematic in a number of ways, but particularly because we're framing this idea of forming a very narrow idea of what sustainable development is and what it should be, and what should be imposed on countries, communities, ecosystems, at the same time as it's failing to make any real changes, and emissions continue to rise. And just to give a kind of example of the scale of change that's really needed to lifestyles to make a dent on CO2 emissions, COVID, which saw so many people around the world restricted to their homes, which saw a reduction in transport, saw a reduction in shipping, that saw an approximate drop of energy-related CO2 by 4 to 5%, right? So all of that activity changing was a reduction of 4 to 5%. Now, if that level continued year on year, so we continue to drop that same amount, keep on dropping that severity, it would almost give us an outside chance of limiting ourselves to 2 degrees of warming. Okay, we need substantial changes and we need them now. And this kind of model of growth doesn't seem to be delivering that. And this has led to numerous theorists, academics, to question the logic on which much of green growth is based on. You know, this idea that we can, in fact, decouple economic growth from emissions and environmental damage. As noted by 2 key critics here, Jason Hickel and Georgios Kallas, examining relevant studies on historical trends and model-based projections, we find that 1, there is no empirical evidence that absolute decoupling from resource use can be achieved on a global scale against the background of continued economic growth. And 2, absolute decoupling from carbon emissions is highly unlikely to be achieved at a rate rapid enough to prevent global warming over 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees C, even under optimistic policy conditions. We conclude that green growth is likely to be a misguided objective and that policymakers need to look toward alternative strategies. This points to how this discourse that again seems kind of benign and benevolent, sustainable development, can, as with our discourses of development more generally, frame a very specific past, a very fictional history of how things have happened, and with it dictate certain futures for people across the world. And this has led to many struggles, much anger, and a demand for kind of reframing this. And this was from last year's COP. So this is Asad Rehman, who's the director of a famous charity in the UK called War on Want. And Asad Rehman said this at the COP conference, within the conference hall. He said, "I'm finding it difficult to convey our anger and frustration at this utter betrayal of people. Hollow words about climate emergency from the richest countries and utter disregard for the science and equity, false ambition and a disdain for justice, a license to pollute with net zero 2050 and carbon markets, 500 years of colonial rule and white supremacy looting the wealth of the global south, and you still value your profits over the lives of Black, Brown and Indigenous people. But we are not without hope. It just will not rest with you, but with us, and we don't compromise on justice." I want you to save that last sentence for the last bit of this talk, when we're going to come back to this idea of where we might go. What I want to point out again is how this story obscures violence as well as the ideology that it contains. And just to kind of draw on that ideology a little bit further, in this famous paper from Luke, he talks about the way that this reframing of sustainability has happened. And Luke says that ecological sustainability boils down to a new form of economic rationality to remake world politics. In a search for the lowest cost method of reducing the greatest amount of pollution in the industrial turnover of global production processes, sustainable development became almost magically an economic and not merely an environmental calculation. The initiatives taken by business to prevent pollution, reduce waste, and maximize energy efficiencies are to be supported as world remaking programs. However, in taking these steps, world businesses reaffirm most existing premises of technology utilization, managerial centralization, and profit generation, now driving advanced corporate capitalism. So I think here we have various ideas tied up with this. And before I move on to this kind of next section here, I think this is a good point to kind of pause and reflect on whatever ideas you had written down that you considered at the start of this lecture, you know, what sustainable development could be, what it could look like. And when I think about sustainable development where I live in Brighton, I think about the local campaigns that we have running here, the things that are providing food, good, healthy local food for people. I think about the way that I expect the hills around here and the forests around here to be thriving as the people in the city should be thriving in many years to come. And I don't think of this kind of cold logic of economic rationalization. So yeah, I mean, I'd love to be able to discuss this with you, and maybe we can pick this up in the Q&A afterwards. It's good to reflect on this point of how we've narrowed down all those ideas and all those possibilities of what sustainable development could be, increasingly around this idea of green growth. Okay, just going to stop for a sip of water. Now, I want to focus now on an actual example. Because we talked very, very broadly thus far, okay, about discourse and ideology. but how does this actually play out in reality and in policy, importantly? And I think this is kind of anthropological bias potentially coming through here. But I think empirical examples really, really matter when we're talking about discourse and about these ideologies and things. You know, how does this happen? Why does it happen? You know, what works, what doesn't, who wins, who loses? These are classic questions of political economy and political ecology as well. And so I want to discuss here net zero as a clear example of how green growth has translated into political demands and policy responses, how diverse groups have kind of shaped these demands, and how those broader ideals of green growth, as well as modernity and progress, are reflected in specific development projects and programs. And this is where my main research actually focuses on these kind of questions. And first, it should be noted that, you know, recent years have seen a growing number of net zero claims. Okay, they've become central to political negotiations and global environmental governance. And we see pledges made on a short, a medium and long-term scales as well. And interestingly, not just by countries, but by private companies, and perhaps most notably fossil fuel companies. So here I have a few headlines and reports. We have Saudi Arabia, Facebook, the UK, Shell. And I think it's no coincidence really that so many groups are finding it easy to make these promises that they will, you know, be net zero by a future defined date, whether that's 2030, 2050 or 2060. But what I want to kind of draw our attention to today is that each of these seems to allow not just for kind of continued economic growth, but not only continued emissions, but often expanded emissions as well. So the Saudi Arabia plan includes drilling for every last drop, basically. Shell is expanding its gas business despite claiming to be aiming for net zero carbon. So what's actually happening here? What does net zero mean? And, you know, how can Shell be carbon neutral or net zero, yet expand production and exploration? Well, the key thing to note here is that it's not based on total carbon budgets. There's no requirement for reductions within net zero. That's the net in the net zero, you know, rather than actual zero carbon. And that means it has to rely on negative emissions technologies, NETs, such as carbon capture and storage, and nature-based solutions, such as conservation or tree planting. And for offsetting to function in this way, emissions have to be made equivalent. They have to be commensurable. Put simply, the carbon sequestered in a forest in somewhere like Peru, where I work, needs to equal the same as one emitted by a plane, for example. So a plane flying from London to Lima needs to emit the same type of carbon that exists in Peru. And we may be kind of comfortable with this logic, but it's really important to point out that they're not the same thing at all. Beyond the kind of justice implications of this, you know, one of those is a non-essential activity. Some clever maths needs to happen to kind of measure the carbon emitted in one place and saved in another. The carbon saved in the trees near my house in Brighton, in the forest here, won't be the same as those in Indonesia, for example. So to do this, we have to have a universal measure, which is metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, or just tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, TCO2e. And this provides a kind of mathematical and financial basis for offsetting carbon generating behavior. And interestingly, it can be expanded to other greenhouse gases as well. So we can quantify things like methane in terms of the carbon dioxide they emit, carbon dioxide equivalent they are. So you can assess the kind of carbon impact of a cow burp. So you see this kind of like abstraction of what stuff actually is to a single measure that can be compared across all sorts of environments. And I think the other thing that's important to note here is that these are absolutely critical to current development and sustainable development policies. All pathways, all of the modeling that's done in the latest UN IPCC report that limit global warming to 1.5 degrees rely almost completely on negative emissions technologies. Okay, so for some of the kind of 2-degree models, they're factored in quite heavily. But if we're to limit to 1.5 degree, which the global community still claims to be aiming for, it's going to rely almost completely on these negative emissions technologies, which is problematic because most of them don't exist yet. We don't have any actual negative emissions technologies. We do have nature-based solutions, as I'll explain. But here we have, more generally, we're thinking back to this idea of discourse. We have a reflection of this dominant paradigm of green growth. Okay, so growth can continue in this concept, including the expansion of oil and gas extraction. Notably in Boris Johnson's speech, he focused on coal. There's a political reason for that. The UK doesn't use much coal anymore, so it's very easy for us to ask others to reduce it. But growth can continue, including for groups who would otherwise be the target of restrictions. So it's not a bug in the system. It's actually written into the logic of net zero as a concept. Shell can not only not reduce, but they can expand their fossil fuel operations. Saudi Arabia can keep extracting oil and gas. The UK can continue to explore new coal mines and sites for offshore drilling. And this is because what it's doing is pushing action, and the action that needs to happen, to a defined future point where that technology and finance is assumed to be available. And again, I'll come back to that quote I've used a few times today, an unconditional faith in the concept of progress here. But I really like this quote for explaining it simply and the kind of inherent ridiculousness of relying on this. This is Professor Kevin Anderson, a scientist who studies these things, who said that current policies amount to, please keep smoking, we'll figure out negative inhalations later. We know we're doing damage, we don't really know how to fix it, but we're backing ourselves to somehow find that out. And we'll be considering the implications of this bottom quote in a bit more detail shortly, because but I think it's important to recognise that it simplifies ecosystems and also produces them for offsetting. Okay, so there's a way of valuing environments differently. So as noted in this paper here, it's reframing conservation action, particularly as an exchange of ecological credits. You're boiling down nature to these simplified figures, where numerical scores that are considered equivalent in both ecological and monetary terms represent nature lost, saved, or recreated. And in some ways, those figures and being able to compare the value of ecosystems can be incredibly useful, but they do involve breaking ecosystems down into legible and quantifiable elements and then making them equal across the planet. So all those, all the kind of competing different ideas of value of what a forest is, for example, and again, thinking of a forest here in Brighton compared to Indonesia, they're very different. They have different values to people. They provide different, ways of living, and they support different things in different ways. But all of those competing ideas of value of what a forest might be, including spiritual, get boiled down and simplified into a single figure. That's a real massive change in how we view the world. And as with the quote I used earlier from Luke, it's a kind of world making in its application, that no longer we're thinking about the natural world, but we're thinking about natural capital in this way. And this discourse around net zero has led to a really rapid growth in interest in ways of offsetting carbon, particularly as those negative emissions technologies don't really exist yet. There's been a real focus on this idea of nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions that treat the natural world in this way. And it's a range of methods, including reducing deforestation, but also tree planting, restoration of environments. And while it can be done in all sorts of different ways, and there are real extremes from plantations of rapid growth trees to kind of rewilding, where you just let land kind of get restored naturally. It's had the support of all sorts of different groups. So Donald Trump has come out in support of natural climate solutions, particularly the reforestation goals. The head of Nestle, the head of Shell, but also activists, left-wing activists. Greta Thunberg has come out in support of natural climate solutions. And for us in the UK, a famous environmental journalist for The Guardian, George Monbiot. So people from direct polar opposites of the political spectrum have come out in support of this, and it makes it an interesting emerging idea in its own right. But also it drives this kind of ambition behind a lot of the goals that are being put out there. You used to get policies like the Bond Challenge, which aims to bring 350 million hectares of degraded and deforested landscapes into restoration by 2030, or the Trillion Tree Initiative, which is unsurprisingly trying to plant 1 trillion trees. And I want us to before moving on to what that looks like on a local level, I want to make 3 kind of interlinked points about that rise of net zero and what that might mean for this linkage between global development and environmental politics. Firstly, that it's fundamentally changed environmental policy for forest areas. Secondly, that it's resulted in a changing valuation of landscapes and the work of conservation specifically. And thirdly, that it's relied ever more on the language and ideology of the private sector. So I'm just going to run through each of those briefly before we move on. And firstly, this focusing of the role of forests and deforestation in the climate debate has also placed it quite centrally within the development agenda as well. So the idea particularly that wealthy countries will be paying for carbon offsettings to meet their goal of reducing emissions, as well as private companies, has been framed as something that could be a triple win. It could deliver not just the emissions that are avoided by deforestation, carbon's not released by burning forests, or that it's sequestered by new forests that are planted, but that this will in turn have benefits for biodiversity, channeling money to conservation initiatives as well, and that conservation, that money should also go towards communities, right? It should benefit local communities who will receive funding for development. So you see a kind of reframing of these ideas around forest politics and forest control around questions of development and international goals as well. So it's a bringing together of climate, conservation and development goals underneath this kind of wider banner. And it's granted it a lot of power in policy debates and kind of more broadly in responses to climate change. And I'd argue through this kind of global development goals and local environmental politics have grown kind of ever more linked in recent years. But on to that second point, that the view of the natural world that stems from net zero and that kind of mathematical simplification of offsetting has led to a way of ranking and prioritizing the natural world. So global development priorities dictating the kind of value of the very ecosystems in which we live. And this graph comes from a very influential but very heavily criticized paper by Gristom and colleagues, which identifies 20 natural climate solutions and then quantifies their potential for reducing carbon emissions. So you can see a kind of range of them here, range of kind of agricultural protection to forest protection. And if you look at the kind of axis at the top here, you can see there's a big break in it here where because the scale is so distorted by the impact that they think reforestation will have. They've had to break the metric to say that it's 10 gigatons per year potential for reforestation. I think that I would disagree with it on a number of levels, obviously, but one of the things that's really interesting here is that reforestation is identified not only as one of the best ways to counter climate change, but the best way. And that's problematic on a number of levels, not least because it's saying that reforestation is better than protecting the forest in the first place, which is counterintuitive for anyone involved in these areas. And one long-time conservation worker in Peru joked to me about this, that it's impossible for him to get funding for conservation anymore because everyone wants reforestation. So he said he was going to start rebranding his conservation work as avoided reforestation to see if that might work. But beyond that kind of joke that he made, there's a serious amount of focus being placed on this recreation of ecosystems rather than the protection of existing ones. And finally, pointing out these kind of new actors and approaches that stem from this, the new institutions, the kind of strange tribes, we might call them, where we need to learn these new languages of management consultants, for-profit companies, tech bros, the kind of ever-growing financialization and quantification that makes ecosystems visible in audits and in financial reviews. And one of the things I always find interesting, it would be very different for you than it will be for me. If you Google net zero and look at the ads at the top of Google, you can see who's paying to try and claim the discourse of net zero. And normally in the UK, it's the big auditors, it's PwC and people like that, or KPMG, who want to be known as leading. So it's an interesting little experiment to do, see who's paying for the ads. But this coming together is being referred to more broadly as neoliberal conservation in this space. And this is from a famous article on this by Jim Igoe and Dan Brockington, where they say that in the context of global neoliberalism, institutions like states, corporations, multilateral financial institutions, and conservation bingos are increasingly interlinked by dense networks of actors, ideas, and money. In fact, it's become increasingly difficult to distinguish where these institutions end and the networks that connect them begin. I think that's a really important point. And you see this with the kind of web of actors who are really pushing nature-based solutions at the moment, you know? So it's not just conservation groups, the big ones particularly, who are trying to claim some of this money, but the kind of giant oil, gas and mining companies and the kind of major consumption groups like Amazon and Microsoft. These are the people kind of setting the terms of what nature-based solutions are. And while, you know, the national offset market's been slow to take off, these private companies have been very rapid about pursuing these nature-based solutions, particularly through what's known as the voluntary carbon markets. So these are the voluntary markets, called voluntary because rather than us having, say, binding requirements to offset carbon, a kind of cap and trade system where people would have a limit to the amount that they can actually emit, or putting a price on carbon, this is a voluntary decision by groups, whether they be individuals, companies, even cities are doing this now, who want to offset their carbon, whether that be for ethics, for corporate social responsibility, or for whatever other purpose. And voluntary markets have been growing rapidly in recent years, are being pushed ever more, particularly in recent years when the former Bank of England governor, Mark Carney, has been heading up a task force to supercharge their growth. And they've also been boosted by some very large deals, huge deals from the oil majors who have switched to offsetting carbon to achieve their carbon neutrality. So if you've actually offset carbon yourself, if you've ticked that box when you've taken a flight to say, we will offset your carbon, that has a good chance it's gone through one of these schemes on the voluntary market. And it's hugely popular, and it's worth kind of considering just how ingrained this has become in consumption and in daily lives. You know, these are just some images taken from the things that I see in the UK. So many companies are keen to do it, and it seems to be pretty much everywhere. And this slide here actually shows a range of different approaches, whether that's offsetting through planting trees, protecting or saving acres of land, which is quite popular here. So many companies are keen to do it. You know, you might have heard of Ecosia, which is a search engine that promises to plant trees when you do your web searches, but all sorts of odd products are doing it. Buy a pair of trainers and you're told it's being offset with forestry, or, you know, the bottom one here is a toilet roll in the UK. So why is your toilet roll telling you to offset your carbon? Interesting. But even, you know, oil, which I think is bizarre. Shell are promoting their carbon neutral oil and carbon neutral petrol, which seem like very, very odd concepts. How can these things, which are pure carbon, ever be carbon neutral? But what I think I find interesting about these programs is not only that it shows this kind of consumer demand and changing discourse around it, but how much is being driven by private companies and how much these schemes obscure. You know, they make these promises, but tell us very, very little about how they're implicated, how they're actually put into practice. And they hide some really complex structures of ownership, of responsibility, of power. And again, to use that language, they have this kind of world-making potential for the models of sustainable development they impose. And so let's look at a brief example of this and think about how these global discourses have resulted in specific institutional arrangements and market mechanisms, and how that's resulted in turn in changes to lives, livelihoods, and ecologies. And this photo is from the San Martin region of Peru, which is where I do most of my research. And San Martin is on the kind of western edges of the Amazon. So it's where the lowland Amazon jungle meets the highlands of the Andes in what's known as the eyebrow of the jungle. And there I did research in a suite of nature-based projects, so a range of them that all work together, run by a French carbon bender, so a private company, private for-profit company that sells credits via the voluntary markets to major brands such as the ice cream company Ben & Jerry's, Nestle's coffee brand Nespresso, and the search engine Ecosia, which has funded some of the reforestation work as well. And so basically, you know, the money goes from those companies. So whether you might buy some ice cream from Ben & Jerry's that says it's offsetting your carbon, or whether you do a search on Ecosia, whether you buy some coffee from Nespresso, they pay this company to offset their carbon through these various projects. And the company does it through a variety of means. It's bought the carbon rights, so purchased the carbon rights to a conservation area, and they sell the credits from that. But they've also implemented lots of these reforestation plantations, which also generate carbon credits. So they're reforestation projects for timber plantations and agroforestry. Agroforestry is providing farmers support to plant trees within their existing plots. And it can be quite lucrative for these companies setting up these models. These are some of the models that are used in the agroforestry systems where I work in Peru. So you can see the kind of trees are planted around a cacao plantation or within it, or they plant just kind of pure timber plantations. But all of these are designed to meet the very minimum legal standards of what a forest is. So they meet the definition of a forest, but they're not quite a forest as you or I might know them. The key is that they're kind of being planted in a very specific form. Okay, so they're designed by experts far from Peru, and dictating very specific forms of forests and ecosystems that the local communities are being asked to implement. And the actual cash benefits from carbon credits in this reforestation scheme here are very, very low for the farmers themselves. They get paid 1 sol per tree planted, which in UK money is about 25p, probably about 20 cents or something in the US. I'm not sure in Indonesia, I'm afraid. But its appeal comes from the fact that they can be integrated into these models. Okay, so the farmers aren't making money from carbon offsets like we might imagine. Really, it's because they're having these rapid growth timber plantations or increased crop growth. And the timber plantations, they have trees which can be harvested and sold in this kind of sustainable harvesting system. So you have many plantations like this, and this is basically almost entirely a single species with a couple of trees interspersed with it. And they're weird, quiet places. I've spent a lot of time in them. They feel completely different to standing in the forest near them. Okay, so this is in the middle of the Amazon, walk kind of 30 minutes the other way, and you've got these amazingly rich, diverse forests. But they're hugely popular, these plantations. And in these plantations, it's a very specific type of tree being favoured. While the project in Peru I worked in actually had quite ambitious tree diversity targets to start with, including a kind of range of growth speeds. A combination of what's kind of popular locally and what's profitable means that farmers tend to plant the trees that are most reliable and which can be harvested the soonest. So this tree here is Capirona. It's a tree that is incredibly popular as it can be grown and sold within 5 to 6 years. So it grows rapidly and quickly be sold downriver. Not much money, for a little bit of money. But it means that while original plans might have aimed for at least a semi-diverse landscape, at best they have 2 or 3 species, but often are focused on just one. So despite this being a kind of nature-based solution, funded by carbon offsets and marketed as forest regeneration in most cases, much of the funding is going towards agriculture, whether that's supporting cacao, coffee, cattle, and also timber plantations. So that money is going to train people to grow and sell timber in the name of conservation, which is something that people don't appreciate when they're thinking about tree planting offsets. You don't expect your money to be going to driving the timber industry. I imagine most people to be expecting to paying for conservation. This obviously has numerous impacts on the local environment. But it also changes how the local communities view and interact with these forests as well. And here's where anthropology, the discipline that I come from, can teach us a lot. By spending a lot of time with these communities, I could document how and why this forest in this slide here is valued locally, this monoculture plantation, and how in turn the kind of weedy, dense, biodiverse forest that surrounds it has started to be referred to as poor or waste. And how local people have started to refer to these trees as timber. So they talk about trees as timber rather than as trees. And what that might mean for our longer term socio-natural relations, right? It's a big change to how we view the world. And when I ask people locally to take me to go and see forest, I often get taken to these plantations rather than to the kind of dense jungle just outside of it. So I think it's an interesting switch that's happening here. But even in the conservation area that's right next to this forest, you know, we used to do quite a lot of trips into the conservation zones, cut trails, prepare things for conservation. One of the heads of conservation of the project was looking at one of the areas that was recovering, you know, from some previous cultivation. And, you know, there was kind of weeds growing and it was all recovering in a kind of weird way, as forests tend to. And he was saying, wow, we need to plant some capirona. We need to speed this up, you know. So there's a subtle shift in what's deemed as natural and desirable. He thought we needed to not leave the forest to recover as it might do, but we should be planting specific types of trees in these kind of dense plantations that you see here. So those global discourses have translated not into just a kind of narrowing of language and ways of thinking about development, but into the very landscapes that we have and our ways of interacting with them. And just to take this further, the kind of money and support on this scheme is getting ever more of it is being focused on helping these farmers extract more and more from their plantations, you know, with technologies and tools used to speed up and regulate the growing process. So the trees are managed to grow as quick and straight as possible. Each seedling is spaced out at an exact distance. You have these, you know, scientifically designed grids of trees. So you can fit as many as possible and kind of optimize the amount that you use. And you can see here in the image on the left that they're also training them to kind of saw off the branches so they grow straighter. But it leaves these slightly eerie plantations. They're kind of devoid of bug and bird life. Yet they're praised for their role in the new green economy. And as noted here, nature's kind of being remade to work harder, faster, and better for carbon offsetting in this instance here. And there are a raft of emerging businesses within Peru that are wanting to turn plantations of nature-based solutions into stable investment opportunities. And they're marketed really aggressively by both companies and government workers who kind of attend these expos and big events, international events, armed with maps of available land around the country. You know, they've designated huge areas of the country deemed open for investment with little consideration really of what exists there already, and with their kind of replicable models that you see here of plantations to appeal with any investor with money. So beyond the kind of physical impacts of the approach, the perceived success of rebuilding the natural world has also put increasing pressure on conservation to be kind of reframed in these productive senses. The conservation should be about growth as well. It should focus on economic growth and sustainability, with that assumption again that these two can and indeed must go hand in hand. And just to show this isn't just show that this is a very global phenomenon. This is a picture from Wales, which is part of the UK. If you're not familiar with Wales, it's a small country next to England in the UK. And this isn't just anywhere in Wales. This is a picture of my family's sheep farm in the Brecon Beacons, a kind of sheep farming area, an area that's famous for its sheep farming and agricultural life, really. But in a similar way to the range of new actors who are dictating local development priorities in Peru, where I work, similar dynamics are playing out here. So this is historically a major sheep farming area, and small-scale farming is kind of deeply ingrained in local identity. And in the new debates over sustainable development, landscapes such as this have taken on more precedence. You know, they've been deemed not green. The ecologies, the livelihoods that they contain have been said, well, these aren't acceptable in an era of sustainable development, while others have been deemed green. So in this area, as the argument goes, land should be best put towards timber plantations rather than sheep farming or diverse land practices. As noted by a senior official on a call recently, I was on a call with someone from WWF, the World Wildlife Foundation, who said that, you know, the UK has to meet its tree planting goals, and Wales has the most wasted land. So unfortunately, these livelihoods are no longer viable. That kind of blows my mind that you can make such a kind of broad statement about ways of life and assume that there's no value to it other than what you deem as most effective for carbon. And as such, it's been bitterly fought by the local communities who want some say in how their land is used. But government groups, environmentalists, and big business, particularly in this case, London finance houses and pension funds, are buying up land for these tree plantations at a really rapid pace, and in doing so, exerting a huge amount of influence on this area. And I've been back to Wales to conduct research this summer and to speak with these local communities who are being kind of disempowered by this drive for green growth. And one of the things that really strikes me is that the new plantations being installed all over these valleys, all over these valleys you see where the sheep are now, are so similar to the ones that I saw in Peru. They're monocultures of tightly packed trees, scientifically designed, but seemingly so out of place in this local landscape. So here we can reflect on the way that these global discourses of sustainable development can obscure local wisdom as they impose narrow or singular views of the world. And in the words of Paige West, Jim Igo, and Dan Brockington, this in turn helps to solidify certain identities and ethnicities and incarcerate them in time and space. Certain things are deemed acceptable and green, others are deemed wasteful. And I just want to reflect here on this idea of how a global development goal has become embroiled in environmental politics. And there's an assumption here that these nature-based solutions will reliably compensate for their emissions, problematic in itself, but without much thought about local conceptions or the type of forests being created or the competing land use claims. And we can see this kind of reflected in the odd outcomes of top-down sustainable development policies or those blunt incentives to maintain growth, such as chopping down of forest for monoculture plantations, such as palm oil or biofuels. You know, and this is Malaysian Borneo, so not too far away. But it strikes me as really perverse, that this image, right? On the left, that's to be a landscape of sustainable development. This is going to be for biofuels. And yet the one on the right is not. You know, it's almost like an ecological visual metaphor for that age-old story of progress, modernity, and growth, that dichotomy of tradition and modernity that's set up here, with the richness of tradition deemed outdated and the new technified, economically productive landscape seen as the only way forward. And you might think back here to Anjani's talk, the first talk that you had on this course, which was talking about that kind of the way humans are often focused on a mastery of nature or dominating nature and the limitations that has. But it's especially important with these ever bigger claims and ambitions for scaling this all up to kind of unprecedented scales. You know, there's claims that it needs to be 30% of the world in protected areas, maybe 50%, planting 1 trillion trees, or tree plantations needed, you know, for reforestation that is said to need a Brazil-sized forest to meet the goal of 1.5 degrees. Or if we factor in bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, needing an area 3 times the size of India. I mean, this is vast. So you can see similar rhetoric here around urgency, top-down solutions to be applied at scale. And there are even plans for carbon plantations to be planted by drones and maintained by algorithms, with no need for humans beyond kind of pressing buttons. I think this should be of great concern for anyone who sees value in forests beyond the service that they provide as carbon sinks or as capital. And this brings us back to the kind of core message of the summer course, you know, this idea of local wisdom. And this is why I'm so excited to speak here today and get a chance to be a part of this program. For you to have heard so many kind of other interesting talks from other speakers, I think it's a real critical issue of our time. How can global goals respect local wisdom? Or thought differently, and perhaps more importantly, how can this local wisdom unsettle those hegemonic approaches to sustainable development? I just want to offer some brief thoughts on this. Firstly, how this kind of universal story of sustainable development is being crystallized, you know, especially around ideas of the Anthropocene, this idea of a kind of single humanity as a geological actor that has caused damage. You know, the idea that climate change is caused by enacting on a singular humanity, you get with these kind of statements, either we stop it or it stops us, which obscures so much of the reality of what's happening. As noted by the Colombian researcher Diana Ojeda and some colleagues, she says that the Anthropocene misdiagnoses the causes of climate change, often placing blame on marginalized populations who have done little to cause the problem in the first place. And it seems kind of patently obvious there are actors geographically who are more to blame for the amount of CO2 emissions and environmental damage more broadly. You know, just looking at this responsibility for total excess carbon emissions, you know, the USA has a huge influence here with 40%, But you take into account the EU and the rest of the global north, the global south only really accounts for 8% of excess emissions. And so various theorists have pointed this out, but Andreas Malm and Alf Hornborg wrote an excellent breakdown of the problems with this idea of the Anthropocene. And they say that as of 2008, the advanced capitalist countries of the north composed 18.8% of the world population, but were responsible for 72.7% of the CO2 emitted since 1850, subnational inequalities uncounted. In the early 21st century, the poorest 45% of the human population accounted for 7% of emissions, while the richest 7% produced 50%. A single average US citizen, national class divisions disregarded, emitted as much as upwards of 500 citizens of Ethiopia, Chad, Afghanistan, Mali, Cambodia, or Burundi. Are these basic facts reconcilable with a view of humankind as the new geological agent? So we have to be really careful here about the way that these discourses try and smooth over inequalities in this way, in the same way that the theorists pointed this out for the story of development in general. And this inequality dimension is really important, and it's really stark. 50% of carbon dioxide emissions come from the top 10% of the population. 70% come from the top 20%. If we need to focus our action anywhere, why is it not here? The top 1% of global emitters emit 2 times the carbon dioxide of the bottom 50%. That's staggering. It's staggering statistics. But the impacts are also not a unified story either. There's a really sharp divide in where we will see the effects of climate change and when. And this is the Global Development Climate Change Vulnerability Index from Oxfam. And it shows how different parts of the world are more vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And they are largely those who have done the least damage. But also looking at this map, it's where a lot of those proposed solutions, things like carbon offsetting, agricultural programs, conservation, it's where people are being asked to change their ways of life. And this brings us to climate justice and environmental justice that I know you've covered a little bit on this course, which is really great. It's such an important issue. And as social scientists, humanities students, however you might view yourself, this should be making us think about how these effects are felt differently, and typically this might lead us to think about geography, might make us think about race, might make us think about gender, about class, but also generational justice. I mentioned the way the negative emissions technologies push action to the future. They discount the cost of future action, putting responsibility to deal with climate change on the next generation. So I think there's a moral imperative here to take these questions of justice into account, summed up by this quote here. All over the world, societies are grappling with the effects of climate change, and yet its impacts are greater in communities whose vulnerability to disaster is the product of a harsh social calculus. And I always share this image because it always blows me away, and I think it's a real stark reminder of where we are with these kind of environmental politics at the moment and this inequality. This is an image from 2017 from a small town near Portland, Oregon in the United States. So you can see the forest burning in the background while these guys kind of carry on their game of golf. I think it points to the crazy levels of inequality and ideological indifference that seems to be baked into the current models that we have. And when we think about things like politics and power, do these models of sustainable development grant increased legitimacy and voice to those that are losing their homes in this fire, or to those on the golf course? But beyond that moral imperative, I think there's also a practical need to embrace diverse voices and understand complexity beyond top-down systems. So I think climate change highlights not just that the impacts we felt differently in different places, but this is made all the more complex by the fact it can be really difficult to link climate change to its impacts and to prove clear causality. We can often assume the role of climate change, or it's referred to as a threat multiplier in security jargon. But to actually assign clear causality is far harder. Equally, the causes and effects are so interrelated. And you probably have seen this through things that you've discussed already. Things like food systems, biodiversity conservation, land rights and uses. They're so interlinked. And as you try and solve one, it might impact on the others. So you think there back to those stats I was using on carbon forestry, how we might have massive plantations the size of Brazil or 3 times the size of India, how that might impact on food supplies and wider ecology. you know, and we could think here about biofuels as well, and how the biofuel boom sparked food price hikes and riots across the world. You know, these things are very interlinked. It's very difficult to untangle them. And in the management literature, this is referred to as what's a wicked problem. You know, it makes technocratic responses that are being favoured in global negotiations incredibly difficult. And all that uncertainty and interconnectedness should lead us to kind of question what global targets can obscure, and how we're already writing in a certain level of acceptable loss into the programs that we have, particularly as we have these kind of global targets, which are an average. Some areas are going to have much higher temperature fluctuations, and, you know, frankly put, 1.5 degrees is already a death sentence to many in low-lying island states. And to take an example here, this is a photo after the wildfires in Australia in 2019-20, the bushfires. Even at 1.1 degrees of warming, Australia saw more than 20% of its forest burn in a single season, and vast damage to its Great Barrier Reef thanks to mass bleaching. And we see similar impacts across the world, you know, most shockingly at the moment in Pakistan. So I think there's a real need here, you know, all of these kind of facts and this complexity make local understandings of problems, causes and solutions not a nice to have, not a we should include them, but essential if we're to meet the challenge of climate change. And to return to Arturo Escobar and his preface to the 2012 edition of Encountering Development, he frames this as the great challenge of our times. You know, he says the present moment can be seen as one of intense struggle between two visions of globality defined as modernity writ large, or globality as a pluriverse. And this idea of the pluriverse, I think, is quite a generative one, quite a useful one for us to think about, and perhaps need to think about on this summer course. The pluriverse is this idea that we should be working towards a world where many worlds fit. Okay, so not just alternative ideas and including alternative voices, but alternative ontologies, a different understanding of what the world is and how we relate to it. So there's a challenge here on the idea of sustainable development, saying that we should move towards this idea of living well together instead. We shouldn't be pursuing a singular development. We should be thinking about how we live well together, convivial living. So here, this is an idea of alternatives to development that are contextual, not top-down, based very much on what's happening locally. Not just different ideas, but fundamentally different worlds. And there's a really fantastic book of these ideas that summarizes about 30 of them. It's really brilliant and it's free to download. I've put a link on this slide here. But just to give an example from where I work in Latin America, there's serious political traction behind alternative conceptions of life beyond these narratives of progress, of modernity, of growth, such as the concept of summa causa, which is written into the constitutions of both Bolivia and Ecuador. And this doesn't translate particularly well to Spanish or to English, so it's reasonably hard to understand. But in general, it's translated as buen vivir into Spanish and living well in English, or good living. Essentially, it's an indigenous concept of well-being, which specifically has this idea that well-being is only possible within a community. And that furthermore, that community isn't just the people involved, it's the place that you're in as well, includes the natural world and our kind of inextricable connections to it. So it's well-being, convivial living with others and nature. It's almost the kind of opposite of those top-down ideas. It's entirely contextual to place, to historic context, to local reality. And this is just a nice way of summarizing its potential, I think, by the Uruguayan political ecologist, Eduardo Gudinas. And he says, Buen Vivir offers a common ground where critical perspectives on development originated from different ontologies meet and interact. It's a space for dealing with other alternate ontologies, but it's also a politically oriented platform as its actors pushes for alternatives to development, such as being relational or the expanded interpretation of political communities. And I'd love to expand on that, but the point is that these alternatives exist everywhere. And a key challenge for development actors not wedded to those top-down approaches is to listen, to understand and to build these connections, to be creative and to be open-minded and flip that priority of whose voice counts. And for the purpose of this talk and for your kind of summer course more broadly, I wanted to end with this comment before kind of summarizing the talk. And this is from Arundhati Roy. who says, if there's any hope for the world at all, it does not live in climate change conference rooms or in cities with tall buildings. It lives low down to the ground with its arms around the people who go to battle every day to protect their forests, their mountains, and their rivers, because they know that the forests, the mountains, and the rivers protect them. And so the message of this talk really is that even if there is a new kind of singular narrative emerging of sustainable development, there are just as many alternatives out there in groups around the world that are connecting up their struggles for a different world and for different worlds. I think this points to the importance of both kind of exposing the weakness of that narrow discourse of green growth and the need for creativity in how we surface and design alternatives. So just to kind of summarize that talk, firstly, we covered that idea that development's not a kind of neutral concept. It reflects those discourses and power relations, especially those ideas of progress, modernity, and growth I referred to. And while sustainable development originally emerged out of a range of concerns about the limits to growth, it's increasingly narrowed around a new story of human progress. And in its current hegemonic, I would argue, framing, it's reliant on green growth, the idea that economic growth can be decoupled from carbon emissions and environmental damage. And this has in turn led to top-down approaches and a reliance on potential technology and future emissions removals. And then just ending with that point that, you know, it's been challenged by a range of actors and can be rethought through the idea of the pluriverse, a world where many worlds fit. So that's the end of my talk, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A. Just to leave you with some questions to think about, to reflect on before we get to the Q&A stage. You know, these first two are kind of linked. I don't think there's a clear answer to whether green growth is possible at any level. I think it's worth us considering these questions. Is continued economic growth possible alongside falling carbon emissions? But on the flip side, is it possible to combat climate change without economic growth? You know, who's responsible for climate change and whose voice counts in negotiations over solutions? What do you think about that and what's important? And should we be saving the world as universe in that singular way? Or should we be embracing the pluriverse, this plural way of thinking? Okay, so that is my talk done. So I'll stop sharing my screen there. And thank you very much for listening. I appreciate that was a really long talk.
Thank you, Dr. William. That was a very, very interesting presentation. And before we get to the question and answer stage, I would like to hand over this event to the MCs because they have an event, an activity scheduled before the question and answer session. So to the MCs, please.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Fai, and thank you, Dr. William Love, for the very insightful presentation. I really can't wait for the further discussion and question and answer session with Dr. William Love. Okay, maybe.
Yeah, it was an interesting.
It's really great, yeah.
Yeah, it is. Okay, so Rifa, I think we're going to have a break, 15 minutes break. So for Dr. William, next you have your break, and we're going to have a discussion. We really hope it surely will be an so for all participants and Dr. William, we're going to have a break. We're going to go back to this room in 15 minutes. Thank you so much.
Okay, so we wish for it for you guys, and please cut the minutes for the question. See you.
Kebanyakan orang gagal diet karena caranya yang salah. Gimana salahnya?
Okay, so welcome back again to today's session of summer course. And after this, we're going to have a discussion session with our esteemed speaker, Dr. William Locke, and our moderator, Mas Faiki Arifah.
Yes,
I hope the
students get a wonderful rest.
rest that with the 15-minute session, break session, yeah. Okay, I think all of our friends and us are ready to have a great discussion with Dr. William Locke now. And before we begin, let me inform that this question and answer session will be an open forum for everyone who would like to discuss anything regarding to the class topic. For all the students who would like to ask, you may raise your hand and wait until the moderator gives you the chance to speak, and you may deliver your question or opinion. Students are also able to deliver the questions through the public chat box in our Zoom meeting.
Okay, thank you so much, Rifa. Let's just get straight into it. Mr. Faik and Dr. William Locke, the floor is yours.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Please, as the MCs have mentioned, please direct your questions immediately, directly either by chatting or through the chat box. Does anyone have any questions? Actually, if nobody has any questions yet, I actually wanted to ask. Oh, here we go. We have a question here. Sophie Yasmin, please, if you would please kindly state your question through the chat, or would you be more comfortable in just stating it through the chat box? Okay, I'll just read the question. Thank you for the great presentation. I want to ask the question regarding economic development. What other indicators besides GDP are there to measure wealth and well-being? What are the best practices for GDP forecasting, growth forecasting? Lastly, how can the informal sector be expanded or developed to address unemployment challenges in developing countries? Thank you. So, Dr. William Locke, we can go straight to the answers.
Great. Well, cheers, Sophie, for that question. That's a really, really good one. A few questions. I think that focus on economic indicators is an important one. You know, I was quite critical of a singular focus on GDP in the talk, but it begs the question, right? How do we measure other forms of progress if we're going to do that? And there are a range of other indicators besides GDP that have emerged in recent years. I mean, in fact, there's a fairly long history of a debate about going beyond GDP. A famous report was written for the French President Sarkozy back in the early noughties, headed up by Joseph Stiglitz, but also Amartya Sen. You know, so this was an idea for many economists that we need to find other ways of measuring the kind of progress of societies in different ways. They've been successful in a kind of range of ways. None have managed to supplant GDP as being central to economies, or to the global economy at least. Certainly, development organizations try to take a broader sense, looking at the Human Development Index is a particularly important index for development groups. You could argue that the SDGs in some ways is trying to measure a broader range of outcomes as well. But I think what's important when we think about discourse is exactly that point of when it becomes central. Like, when does it become the thing that countries focus on to deliver, to measure themselves, to measure their progress by? The only real example we have of a country centering this is Bhutan, which has focused on national happiness as their measure of how successful the country is being. I think that's a really fascinating experiment, and one that bears plenty of attention and analysis. I think I could certainly make an argument that we'd be happier if we focused on happiness. Other countries have tried to fudge it a little bit more, right? Tried to find a bit of a balance between economic development and other measures of well-being. So particularly within the development sphere, we have the growth of what's known as subjective well-being. The UK has focused quite heavily on this, particularly through successive right-wing governments, which is quite surprising in some ways. But what that is asking people to rate how happy they feel and rate how they feel about certain aspects of their life and well-being. So it's a really messy indicator, you know. I mean, I think any economist would find it very difficult to take that seriously compared to kind of hard factors. But I think the more that we dispel with the idea that GDP is a useful measure in itself, you know, we don't know whether GDP shows good things or bad things. So if I were to, the famous example is if I were to fall down the stairs now and break my leg, that would register as GDP if I went to a private health clinic because it's spend within the economy, right? So it doesn't measure things particularly usefully. It's just the current dogma, it's the current way of thinking. So I think there are a range of other ways of doing that. Best practices for GDP growth forecasting, I think we need to break it down. I think we need to be smarter. I think we need to take into account far greater number of factors. And again, I think it's worth recognizing that GDP is historically not that important. It's only recent generations that are focused on it so much. Even going back to 70s, 80s, in places like the UK, the most important economic measure was your balance of trade. It was how much you were selling to the external economies and how much you were buying, right? And by that, you were getting a sense of how successful your economy was. GDP was seen as a kind of crass measure in comparison, but has taken more focus ever since, particularly with this idea that all countries need 3% compound growth or more. So I think there are plenty of other practices for GDP forecasting. My point would be to break it down and look at the underlying factors. And in the informal sector, how can it be expanded or developed to address unemployment? I think it's a really good question. I think unemployment is an issue. I think underemployment is a real issue as well. So again, my sense is to move away from targets and metrics on this, where countries such as the UK and the US have focused extensively on their figures of unemployment. They've created it creates perverse incentives to basically mismeasure the thing. So in the UK, we tend to measure unemployment and include the people who are underemployed. So they don't work enough to earn enough to live, you know, and it's a bizarre way to try and measure the success of employment. So I don't think metrics of success and targets particularly are a good way to do that. I think it's about valuing those other forms of employment and valuing other forms of contributing to the economy. And most famously, that comes from feminist work looking at the role of housework and how that's undervalued, specifically by capitalist economies, to degrade women, degrade the rights of women. So I think it's my argument would be more along those lines, that we need to find other ways of valuing what people do and how people live their lives that go beyond what they necessarily contribute to global economies.
Thank you for your answer, Dr. William. And so we see that the GDP indices are, we need further exploration on maybe other standards of measuring happiness or measuring change or measuring wealth, and maybe this is the way forward. And so we have a question from Sussex Mohammed. Yes, Mohammed, you've raised your hand. Could you state your question either through chat or through the chat box? Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Fight. Morning, Dr. Locke. I believe it's a sunny day today in Brighton. I hope you're having a great day. Yeah, I'm really missing it. And then I want you to ask several questions actually, and I want to have further discussions with you, Dr. Locke, if I may. So I'll begin with the how Indonesian cultures and then how Indonesian educations view the so-called development as a modernism in our cultures. We view local wisdoms, cultures, especially traditional cultures that are very few people's uphold it right now. it's something. It's sort of like something that it is our past, not our future, and we are viewing this as something that we can that we need to replace, and we're proud of it, sadly. And then there's so many, for instance, in our educations, we are deeply in our educations. We are tends to have more modernistic views and more Westernist views rather than utilizing local wisdom as a media or solutions to our fast changing, rapid changing world. And then I would like to ask questions about the underlying factors of it. Is it because the what is it called? Single stories that has been around for so many years in the world? Because when I was learning the single stories with Daniela Soto Hernandez when I was in Sussex. In our seminar class, we are viewing these single stories as something dangerous because we are viewing, let's say, development as something that is so Western, and we are forgetting about our local wisdoms. And then the second one is, I think there's something missing today, Dr. Locke. Usually when you are ending your presentations, you are recommending us some movies or maybe podcasts that it is really interesting. Maybe you can recommend us your preferred movies for these occasions. Thank you very much, Dr. Locke. Have a nice day.
Thanks, Mohammed. Yeah, lovely to see you again, and great to get that reflection from the Indonesian context. And, you know, in my role at Sussex and in general working how I do, the most important thing for me is to hear those stories from different parts of the world and, you know, how different they are, but the similarities and differences are always interesting. I think drawing on education is such an important thing, you know, as we discussed on the module back at Sussex. Education is so critical to the way that certain ideologies are reinforced. And that kind of brings me to your question, you know, why is this the case? Why do these single stories and this kind of dichotomy of tradition and modernity continue? And I think it's a tricky one to answer, but I think the part of it is thinking about this idea of ideology. And ideology is a kind of contested word and concept. I think historically, and particularly if you look at Marxist thinkers, they consider ideology as kind of like a screen that blocks us from seeing the real world. And I don't think that's how ideology functions. I think more it's the way that we find ways of structuring and making sense of the world around us. It's the kind of logical things that we fall back on to make sense of the world. And I think that's how they can become so easily ingrained. They become common sense. They become the thing that you don't necessarily question, but you use to explain how things happen. So I think that's why it's been such a powerful story that was told. It frames a very powerful and kind of compelling history of humanity. And that's what development does. It's a kind of fictional history that it tells of the entire world. But with it, it paints a picture of the future as well. And that's the bit that I think is particularly damaging, you know, that by obscuring history and drawing a specific path of history, you limit the opportunities and options we have going forward. What I would say with that, particularly at this era, this kind of point we're in, is I think more than ever in human history, we're questioning that story. You know, we're seeing that path that we're being told is not necessarily possible. And that's kind of why the focus of my talk was on this idea of how sustainable development is retelling that story. Because I think we can't fall for that idea that we're all going to live in those societies that are full of high-tech farms and everyone's wearing lab coats or flying around in cars, right? It's because it's the same failed story that actually results in inequality and some people paying for that lifestyle for the very few. So I think it's a really important time to think about those different histories and to think about what we can learn from those different cultures that exist within us that haven't bought into a certain ideology of the world that frame the world in that way. We owe it to ourselves and to them to hear and listen and think about it. and to work with people. You know, I don't see this as drawing another dichotomy or another division between local wisdom as being something out there that we need to learn from. Actually, it's evolving as everything else is, and we can have conversations with that and discuss and learn from each other. It can't be treated either as a kind of backwards tradition or something that's hailed as something that we can never understand. These are dynamic, evolving knowledges that we are lucky to be a part of and have conversations with. I think that's the key, is bringing people together, discussing and being creative about the alternative futures that are available to us, that we could create as communities, and how that might be different everywhere in the world. And I think that's exciting, despite how terrifying this current era is, I think, in a lot of ways. And then you're right, podcasts and films, I didn't include any. Normally that is exactly what I like to end with. I did remove one podcast that I did have in this presentation, but thought I'd take it out, which is a podcast about the history of climate change denial and how carbon offsetting took center stage. And that's a podcast called Drilled, which is really nice. It's kind of like, it's a series, so you have to start from series 1, episode 1. But I think it's a really interesting story that talks about how carbon offsetting became so central, and how private corporations kind of frame this idea of carbon footprints, personal responsibility, and the implications that has for sustainability. That would be my podcast recommendation. Film recommendation, I'll give you 2 that I really like on this topic. One is called Dead Pigs. That is a film from China. I need to look up the director. Let me just double check. It's by Kathy Yan, who did one of the DC films, one of the superhero films. But it was her first film, and it's brilliant. And it talks about the kind of rapid development of China and what that feels like to local communities. And for me, always interesting, the role of agriculture within all of this as well. So the title alludes to the spreading of diseases for pigs. But really funny film, really clever film, and I really enjoyed that. And then if you're interested in a documentary on this, there's a documentary called Honeyland, which is about a local honey gatherer, gathers wild honey, sells very small amounts of it just to kind of get by, and has a kind of life that she enjoys doing that. And then someone comes in to try and extract as much honey as possible. And it's an interesting playing off of these different conceptions of how we might live with the natural world. So I think it's quite a powerful documentary. So that would be my other one, Honeyland. But thanks for the prompt.
Thank you very much, Dr. Locke, for your answers. Netflix and Honeyland, it's very interesting movie as well. I do agree. I think you have mentioned it on our first meeting on social change, culture, and development. And I believe that is very, very beautiful movies, especially the first one, the Netflix.
Yeah.
And thank you very much, Dr. Locke. Have a nice day.
You too.
Yes, thank you, Mas Muhammad Sakti, for the question. Will there be any more questions from the students? If not, could I wanted to ask, oh, here we go. There's a question from Dewi. Thank you, Dr. Will, for the very insightful presentation. From your presentation, I get the point how capitalism exploits the environmental agenda discourse. Seeing today's environmental discourse is a battle area between civil society, government, corporation, I want to know your view about the position of NGOs in this battle area of discourse, since the civil society is usually represented by the NGOs, but in fact, NGOs more represent the corporation's agenda. For example, in the panel energy, the infrastructure of panel energy only can be provided by the industry, so it's benefit to the industry. Secondly, how is the position of foreign aid institution in this battle, in this contested area of discourse? Is foreign aid institutions being more like instruments to pursue a few actors' interests?
Great questions. Thanks, Dewi, and lovely to hear from you. Thank you again for your help in organising this. It's been amazing. Okay, so to get to these points, firstly, NGO. It's a great point. It's a really great question, and it's an interesting area for study and analysis. I think the first thing to think about when we think about NGOs is whether that category is that useful anymore. I say that because the sheer diversity of organizations that fit underneath that banner make it very hard to kind of analyze their role in any serious way, I guess, which is why you might have noticed in the presentation, I relied on this big international NGOs, which I feel have taken on a kind of character of their own. They're actors who operate in a fairly specific manner and have a huge amount of power. Equally, I wouldn't want to say that that's the same for all NGOs, because some of them, I work with tiny NGOs in Peru who do incredible work, same in Wales, these are small NGOs that have the opportunity to make changes. So I don't think we can say with any certainty what NGOs do as a kind of broad category, but these big international NGOs, I agree on a number of levels. They've often had to accept the discourse of industry and operate with industry. And I think there are a number of issues with that. I think it's part of the issue of operating at an international level. They feel like they have to do that and they have to maintain scale. But it's meant that they've depoliticized a lot of their demands in what are inherently political arenas, And I use that example of World Wildlife Foundation in Wales, but their work internationally is far worse than what they do in Wales. They've been implicated in human rights abuses. So they have an awful lot of power, and I think it's a real issue that needs focus. But I do think it connects with your second point as well, which is the way that aid operates, and thinking about aid as an institution, as a kind of international framework at the moment. And a lot of that aid money, if we look at the kind of history of aid, a lot of it was used originally to kind of bolster the giving donor countries' economies, so you'd have famous cases like Canada used to channel most of their aid towards agricultural aid, where they would provide countries with things like tractors that were Canadian made, that then farmers were then tied in to buying the parts and repairs from Canada, so it was always part of supporting broader economic objectives within the donor country. I think that broadened out, and the role of these international NGOs first expanded what development aid could do. And then over time, I feel like we're in an era of contraction again. As you say, they're kind of limited in the types of things that they say and the types of things they do, and they're very implicated in this kind of capitalist system, really. So I feel it's an era where that needs to split apart. At the same time, there's a counter movement to move back to that era of development aid being very tied to national objectives. So this is something we see in the UK at the moment, where the idea of aid and the UK aid budget has become deeply politicized. So they've tried to reduce the amount of aid. They have reduced substantially the amount of aid that the UK is giving, and they've integrated the previous Department for International Development within the UK trade strategy. So we see that kind of return to aid being used as a way to bolster national ambitions and national economies. So I think it's a very difficult era, but I would say these are broad categories that have changed historically dramatically and can change dramatically. So I don't think all NGOs have to work with organizations. I think some can be deeply political. I don't think all aid has to necessarily be kind of corrupt or tied up in the actor's own interests, but I do think those are trends we are seeing. With that, I would say a good NGO should always be unafraid to take on politics and to be implicated in politics in some ways. So I always like to see them tied to social movements, things that come from the bottom up, things people are demanding, things that people want, rather than these top-down prescriptive schemes that look good on their reporting. I would say the best book on this in terms of showing how these kind of ideas and ideals circulate within practice circles is actually quite an old one. David Moss's Cultivating Development shows brilliantly how these discourses circulate and how project practices that are driven by aid money tend to reflect the ideals of the donors rather than the receivers, even through participatory processes. So that's a good book on that, I think.
Thank you for your answer, Dr. William Locke. So there is another question from Ahmad Nur Hasim. Dr. William, I have a question, a huge gap between global north and global south. Sometimes I think that it is impossible to make more balance around the world because the International Work Division, who is the producer of technology and high value products, who is the supplier of raw materials like coal, palm oil, cheap labor, etc. That's determined by rich countries. They control the World Bank, IMF, UN, financial and knowledge resources. Can you imagine that there is no developed country in America and Africa which shows low indicator level of income and prosperity? Will SDGs 2030 really reduce that global gap? Thank you.
Yeah, great question, very powerful, and I agree. I mean, firstly, if we take a step back and look at this question you've asked, this should be a scandal. It's appalling that we continue with such inequality whilst telling this story of equity, you know? And I think back to that quote that I used from Asad Rehman at the Conference of Parties and his fury, you know, this is still, even with all these things we're learning now about the need for equality and the fact that we are facing global problems, they still value profits more than anything else, you know? I think it's a, you know, as much as the kind of corrupt and power aspects here, I think it's a real limit to the imaginations of these global organizations that we have. But that doesn't need to limit us, and it doesn't need to limit what we believe and fight for as something different. And again, that's how Asad Rehman ends that argument he made, you know, there is hope, it just doesn't lie with you, and it lies with us, and we don't compromise on justice. So I can imagine things changing, because we have to be able to have that imagination and creativity to think about what another world would be, you know. It's easy to think that this unequal and appallingly unethical world that we've created is some kind of natural progression that has happened. You know, we could tell the same single story flipped over to talk about inequality and make it sound just as natural, make it sound just like it was meant to be and can never change. But in reality, the economy, the global situation has changed multiple times at different points in global history. And there have been times where it looked like that was going to flip, where, you know, people were going to focus more on inequality, where people were going to work together. You know, the non-aligned movement of third world countries was a spectacular example of this, and almost succeeded in so many ways. But any of these movements that, even if we look back and say, well, maybe they didn't achieve their objectives or whatever, the fact that they're able to change people's perspectives and persuade people that it's possible to fight for these things, I think is really, really critical. So I think, I don't think the SDGs will reduce that global gap. I feel, you know, there's this old thing, anytime a metric becomes a target, it becomes a bad metric. You shouldn't measure something and then target doing it because you get perverse incentives. So I don't hold much hope for the SDGs. I think they're laudable in lots of ways. My hope lies with people fundamentally trying to change the system. And I see great inspiration from that around the world all the time. And that Pluriverse book is a really excellent example of that. It shows you the alternatives people are putting forward that would genuinely change the world and would genuinely change that relationship. Will it happen? You know, it's unknown. It's for us to fight for, I think.
Thank you, Dr. Locke, for the explanation. We have another question from Niputo Ayu Eka Sundari. Thanks for the nice explanation. Since you explained about population growth will need more exploitation about natural resource, I saw a different thing happen in some villages in Japan, that some agricultural land are abandoned because of the lack of population growth. Therefore, some area couldn't develop well in infrastructure, health access, and etc. What is your opinion about this condition? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that one. It's one I should really clarify. I don't think population growth naturally leads to exploitation of natural resources. So that is something that is written into the kind of ideology of sustainable development, certainly from the Brundtland Commissions. That's why I pointed out that relationship that is drawn. I would argue almost the complete opposite, that that's not the case. I don't think population growth naturally leads to the depletion of natural resources. There's a connection there, but it's not a very good one. As I pointed to with some of those statistics about the Anthropocene, the people using the most resources are not the places where you get rapid population growth. I think that connection is weak. A lot of it comes to a theoretical paper written on the idea of the tragedy of the commons, which is this idea that as more people use a shared resource, everyone tries to extract as much as they possibly can, and therefore they degrade the resource. That was a thought experiment, and there's no empirical evidence to prove that. And in fact, we get more and more evidence that actually commons, the idea that we can share resources, can be very well maintained by communities. And it's not about population size. People are actually very good at maintaining and organizing shared resources. I think there's not no relation between those two things. I think it's a red herring to focus our attention there. I don't think that's a very English idiom. It's a mistake to focus our attention there. It's a distraction from the reality of where consumption happens. But to your point on Japan, where you get lack of population growth, I mean, this point's the thing. I think, number one, there are areas that now are asking and needing population growth. The main answer for that, for me, is migration. Right? Like, we have a global population that is increased quite dramatically, and people always complain about population growth as being a major problem. And then you get many developed countries with hollowed out countrysides, or with falling population and demanding more. But then they have these very strict migration rules. I don't think there's an easy answer. I know in Japan there's various policies to try and stimulate population growth, which is fine, and then other countries are desperately trying to reduce it. I think trying to control population is almost impossible, and converge on kind of fascistic tendencies almost. You shouldn't be telling people whether they should have kids or how many kids they should have, in my opinion. But I think, migration could be one answer to it.
Thank you for your answer, Dr. William. So we have another question from Mika Ogura. Thank you for your interesting lecture. Carbon dioxide is thought to be the cause of global warming, but the exact mechanism is still not known. Some scientists believe that global warming is simply a cyclical change in the Earth with ice ages coming over time. What should I do to call such people to protect the environment?
Cool. Thanks, Mika. That's a really good question. Just to be very, very clear on this one, there is scientific consensus that carbon dioxide is the cause of global warming. And beyond that, it's human-induced carbon dioxide use that is causing global warming. There's a 99.7% consensus. There's almost no chance that it is just cyclical. So, I mean, to be really clear, the scientific evidence on this is concrete now. We know this is a fact. Humans have caused climate change. The question is how we frame that in some ways. So this is why I said there's a danger in this idea of saying that humans caused it. A very specific group of people caused it, and specific social systems have caused it. But it's not a natural occurrence, and we know that for a fact now. If you're asking how you convince those people, I think showing them that convincing evidence, the stuff that comes out in the IPCC reports, is compelling. It's fairly scary now, because what we know about what's going to happen as a result of climate change. But I also think there's a bigger question here, which I really like about the fact that you frame this as kind of protecting the environment, as rather than saying reduce their emissions. Because I think climate change should call our attention to the fact that this is not just a question of balancing carbon budgets, right? That's important. There's a factor in it. The social systems we have are destroying the planet on a number of levels, and we should think about how we should reframe our connection to the natural world in many, many cases. So I think best way to convince people to protect their environment is thinking about how they live with it, and not treat it as something out there to be protected by others or to pay for it to be protected elsewhere, but to live with it in a convivial way, to treat the natural world as part of our community and part of our systems that we live within, and enjoy it, and realize that that's where a lot of the joy from life can come from. I think Japan's got some great examples of that, you know, the kind of leaf watching stuff in autumn and spring, the cherry blossom season. I think that's amazing. It's a chance for people to come together and appreciate the beauty of the natural world. So I think that's one answer to that. It's just get them to spend time enjoying the natural world and recognizing their place within it.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Dr. William. So we have a further question from Dewi, which is one more question. Dr. Will, do you recommend any book using the anthropological perspective in seeing this issue? One book which you really recommend to read. Thank you so much. It's very insightful and informative for the informative answer. I really enjoy your session.
Thanks, Dewi. So the David Moss book is anthropological, but actually to explore some of these points, the Arturo Escobar book is slightly anthropological. But in the context of Indonesia, actually, there's a really fantastic couple of books written by Tanya Murray-Lee, who's an anthropologist. The Will to Improve is an excellent one, and Land's End, also excellent. And then she wrote a recent book with Pujo Sumedi, an Indonesian researcher, called Plantation Life, which came out last year, which is also fantastic. So Tanya Murray-Lee's work is really powerful, I think. And if I was going to recommend one, I would go with The Will to Improve, maybe.
Thank you for your recommendations, Dr. William. Will there be any more questions from the participants? Okay. I actually had a question and a reaction to your to the thought experiment that you proposed in the beginning of your presentation. So indeed, my concept of sustainable development is still based on technology, right? It's very eco-modernist. I, to be honest, I was like thinking about sulfate aerosols and fusion and very high tech sort of thing. Yes. So I wanted to focus on the disappointment with these sorts of visions of development. Like, as you mentioned, there are different discourses on development, different definitions. And I wanted to ask, like, how do we sell this? How do we cushion people, or how do we like explain to them that this about face, like from the previous models of development, they tended to neglect local wisdom, but suddenly now we're promoting it again, and as a consequence, a lot of people I've worked with some development programs, and a lot of people were very surprised that now they were being asked to resurrect their older practices of, for example, land rotation. Like a concrete example was recently I had a social mapping task, and we wanted to introduce solar cell-powered lamps in a village, and our partners were at first they were very impressed, but then we introduced the rigorous methods of maintenance, and then they were very disappointed. And they thought that there was a one-stop solution to their problems. They wanted the ease of technology coupled with green growth, which to them was the promise. This is what you promised us. Why are you now turning back to more to their view, more primitive methods, more outdated methods? So how do we sell that, or how do we explain to them, maybe?
Yeah. great question, and one that I come across a lot in Peru, where I work, where people aren't rejecting these plantations that are failing; they're really embracing them because they make money out of them, and that's completely valid. I think to start with, your reflection on what sustainable development felt like to you, I completely understand that, and I think part of this idea of having the concept of the pluriverse is that it's fine to have different ideas of the future and different worlds that might exist. And some people view the future as, having high-tech cities and having more goods available to them and that kind of stuff. And I don't want to disadvantage that at all or discredit it. What we need is to not, at the same time, discredit other ways of living. And that's the problem with the story as we have it now, that it suggests there is only one way or one future that there could be. So, it's totally fine that you might be there in your flying car in the city and I'm out farming goats in the countryside. Like that should be okay. Both should be deemed acceptable futures and both part of an evolving future. How to sell that to people who have been told what is not necessarily true for a long time is an important point as well. I'd probably take issue with the idea of, do we have to sell it to them at all? Like, if you have to sell something to people, you're falling back into the same issues that development's always had, of going into communities and telling them what's best. A lot of the time, these communities know what's best. They knew when, traditional methods were pushed off the land, and if communities want to pursue a path that is technologically informed, and that's where they want to invest their money and time, I don't think that should be discouraged. I think we should be open to how people want to do things. And it doesn't denigrate their traditional practices if they're adapting them and making them technologically based. We can't contain these as some kind of like past practices that are now better. And if we think that, we should be doing them ourselves, I think. I have faith in people that if we listen to them, if we discuss with them, if we talk through different options and allow different options to take place and not prioritize one with incentives. So if they're told that they're going to make millions out of something, then people will choose differently. And I think it's not our place to dictate what they should do. So, I would call not to sell to them anything, but to increase the dialogue and try and change the conversation in general around the idea that these are traditional practices on one hand and high-tech ones on the other. But it is very tricky in practice.
Yes, thank you, Dr. William. Yes, I was very touched with your explanation of those very artificial attempts to reproduce nature and how it's uncanny and eerie, and it follows the logic of consumerism and how it results in very very odd spaces where nature is not really there, but it's the artifice. And thank you for your lecture. I think will there be any other questions? We have 5 more minutes. If not,
Okay, thank you for the very, very thoughtful question and answer session, Dr. Locke. Okay, so before we close this session in day 4,
we're gonna take some photos together. So to all participants, please turn on your camera on so we can take a documentation with Dr. Locke.
Okay, we'll be waiting for you guys to turn on your camera. Okay, for the participants, don't forget to fill in the participant absence link in the Zoom chat below.
Okay, to the operator, please take the photo and the country. 1, 2, 3, smile. One more time. 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay.
Thank you. Last but not least, Dr. Locke, please give your closing statement on today's session.
Yep.
Great. Well, I think I tied up most of my closing statements within the presentation and through that Q&A. But I think, again, the main thing to kind of leave everyone with is not that this is a story of doom and gloom. There has been a damaging history told, but what that tells us is the reality of history is richer and more interesting, and investigating that is rewarding in itself. But the aspect of creativity and working out what that means about what our future could look like is really the thing that I think is the future for all of us. We don't need to just be academic students who critique anymore, but we could be thinking in those creative terms and working together with people to create different futures.
It was such an amazing closing remark, Riva, from Dr. Locke.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Locke.
Okay, so before we close the session, participants, please fill the attendance link on the chat Zoom.
Chat Zoom, yes. Okay, Riva, I think that's the wrap for today's session. Before we close, we just heard a closing remark from Dr. Locke. Thank you so much for Dr. William Locke for the insightful presentation. And thank you, Mr. Fike, for leading the discussion session earlier. I hope the session will be beneficial for all of us.
Thank you to everyone. It's a really fantastic time to spend with people. I would love to be able to do this in a classroom one day with you all. So thank you very much. And cheers, Fike, for moderating. That was brilliant.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you so much.
Thank
you, Dr. William. On behalf of the organizing committees, we would like to apologize if we have done any mistakes throughout the event.
Again, thank you everyone for gracing our ceremony with their presence. We truly appreciate it. We wish you a very beautiful day and see you in the next session. Okay, so after our session today, we would like to know the impression
of our audience.
Yes, maybe
of today's session.
Anyone would like to give your opinion about today's session, our beloved participants? Or Rifa, maybe we can just ask someone to, give their impression about today's session.
I would like to ask
Putu Ayu Eka.
Okay, right.
Can you please
tell us your impression on today's session, please?
Thank you, Dr. William. Today's session actually very great for me, and this year, especially this one, I will entering my master degree at Keto University. So your lecture is really helpful for me to prepare the master life. Thank you.
Wow, it's amazing. Dr. William Locke, do you want to have anything to say in advance?
No, that's great. That's such a good university as well. You'll love it. And there's nothing honestly more rewarding than the master's programs. It's just, yeah, such a nice chance to meet people from around the world and have really deep, in-depth discussions. So yeah, enjoy it. Sorry about the weather in the UK. We can't change it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Locke.
Okay.
I would like to ask one more audience.
Right, sure.
This session is really, really interesting.
It was amazing, yeah.
Okay.
What about Mr. Fuji? Can you tell us your impression on today's session?
Hi, Mr. Fuji. Are you there?
Yes.
Yeah, he's there.
Actually, question for Dr. William, but I don't know why nobody responds with my hand. So alhamdulillah. So I'm currently now studying in International Islamic University of Islamabad in Pakistan. So all the presentation is really interesting for me because I have a really good intention in the environmental matters. So thank you very much for the lecture, sir.
Cheers, Fuji. Thank you for that. And yeah, you know, I mentioned it very briefly in the talk, but we're all, you know, thinking of Pakistan at the moment. The flooding out there is truly terrifying. So I hope you are safe. I hope you're well, and your family and friends as well.
Alhamdulillah, sir. Here, all the thing is running well, but yeah, the economy is really down, decrease, and yeah, you say that the GDP is also very crucial things in the sustainable development. So yeah, here, Alhamdulillah, rupiah is good increase. So all the things is going work well.
It's good to hear.
Right. Thank you so much for Mr. Fuji and Dr. Locke. Okay, Rika, I think that's it of today's session, the second session of this Friday. Okay, I think that's a wrap. Thank you so much for all participants. Thank you so much, Dr. William Locke. We're hoping to see you soon. And thank you so much for Mr. Pike as well. Have a good day and cheers all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.